Okay, hello everyone. So I have the pleasure to welcome Lisa Spantig from University of Essex, who is going to talk about flexible microcredit, effects on loan repayment and social pressure. Lisa, it's a pleasure to welcome you in the NOVAFRICA seminar. I'm sorry it cannot be in person, but I'm sure it's going to be a nice seminar for everyone. So thank you for coming, and the floor is yours for, let's say, around up to 1 hour and 20, something like that. It can be less. Typically, we have a few questions at the end, but we also open for questions during the seminar. It's important to have in mind that people can ask questions. If you can use voice, it's okay, but if you cannot, you can use the chatting box. Okay? Thank you very much. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's my pleasure to be presenting joint work with Kristina and Anett on flexible microcredits. And please feel free to ask questions anytime. I think there is plenty of time for discussion. So very briefly, why do we care about microcredit? Well, microcredit is a way of giving access to finance to the poor who are unbanked and would not usually get a credit from traditional banks. And microcredit has been very successful, at least in terms from the lender, by having very high repayment rates. And that's maybe surprising, given that the poor, you might think that the poor might not be as reliable or might not have collateral, so it might be less secure to lend to the poor. There are two important innovations in microcredit that are attributed to these high repayment rates. And the first one is that you need to repay same-sized, regular, high-frequency installments. So that's very technical. The idea is that you always repay the same amount. So, for example, pay €5 each week. And this is thought to instill a repayment routine and morale. So you get used to this repayment, and it's cognitively easy to understand, and that's why you keep on repaying. The second feature that leads to high repayment rates, or has been attributed to high repayment rates in microcredit, is joint liability group lending. So the idea here is that clients form groups, lending groups of 3 to 7 people each, and everyone in the group receives a loan, but then the group as such is responsible for the repayment of each individual loan. So this has been implemented to provide mutual insurance between the group members. So the idea here is that if I face a shock and I cannot repay in a given week, Pedro might help me out, and vice versa. It also leads to repayment enforcement, because if Pedro knows that I could be repaying but I don't, then he would put pressure on me to make sure that I repay myself, because otherwise he would need to chip in. So these two features that have been attributed to the high repayment rates in microcredit have more lately also been criticized for their adverse effects that they're having on the borrower. So these very rigid repayment schedules of always repaying €5 each week can result in over-indebtedness, because these rigid repayments are incompatible with the fluctuating income most of the microcredit clients face. So here clients would take another additional loan to cross-finance their debt, leading to more debt than they actually could take. On the other hand, these very rigid repayment schedules, usually starting the week after you took the loan, can lead to underinvestment, because if you invest into a project that only yields a profit after a month, let's say, then you would not invest the full amount, but you would keep €20 for the first 4 weeks of repayments, so you don't invest the full loan amount. And also joint liability has been lately criticized because it induces very high peer pressure, and here I use the word excessive, to mean that when clients can observe each other's shocks and they know the shocks are not caused by themselves, but they are exogenous, still a lot of pressure in terms of costly punishment has been issued by microcredit clients. And then in addition, there's this broader discussion related to the poverty reducing effects of microcredit. And overall, in terms of average effects, there's only limited effect of poverty reduction by microcredit. So there's this call for more flexible and a targeted product design that better meets the needs of these clients. And this is why we're interested in repayment flexibility. And flexibility in repayments has been shown to be beneficial for the borrower. And the main idea here is that it increases income by facilitating high risk, high return investments. So that looks very nice. However, when you look at the microcredit landscape, you will see that there are hardly any loans being offered that have such a flexible repayment component. And why is this? Well, if you talk to practitioners, they insist that these rigid loan repayments, so always repaying the same amount with a high frequency, is necessary to create this repayment discipline. Now, what does the literature say on this repayment discipline? Not much. So for empirical evidence on defaults, we see mixed evidence. On the one hand, there are studies that find higher default when flexible repayment schedules are in place, and other studies find lower default. And in general, like all these studies attribute their findings to high risk, high return projects, where in the case of the studies finding higher default, on average, the clients were unlucky, so most of their high risk projects failed. And in the lower default studies, the projects were on average successful. If you look more closely in the argument made in these studies, it's all about ex ante moral hazard, so how clients invest their loan. And that's what we call ex ante moral hazard. However, here this practitioner's argument, this is more about whether you decide to repay once the returns to your project have been realized. So this is ex post moral hazard. And so this is slightly different. And the practitioners, they don't really worry too much about how do clients invest their loans, but they're more worried about strategic non-repayment, or what I will be calling strategic default. And we know that the strategic default, or this ex post moral hazard, is important determinant of repayments in rigid contracts. So we will be looking at how repayment flexibility impacts ex post moral hazard in flexible contracts. In addition, what we also want to add to the literature is that flexibility can also change dynamics in lending groups, and we will discuss this in more detail. So the overall research question of this study is, how do flexible loan contracts affect ex post moral hazard, so the decision to repay, and social pressure. And what we will be doing is, we will be comparing rigid and flexible repayment schedules, where in our case, flexibility means that you can postpone one repayment installment to the next period. So it's a particular type of flexibility, and I will talk in the end a bit more about other types of flexibility, but for the main part of the talk, this is the postponement of the repayment installment to the future. So we will conduct a lab in the field experiment with 600 plus microcredit borrowers in the Philippines, and we will play microcredit lending games where we will focus on individual repayment decisions. To study the effect of flexibility, we will create exogenous variation in the availability of flexibility, and we will also provide exogenous variation in the possibility to exert social pressure by studying individual and joint liability treatments. What do we find? In one sentence, we see that flexibility increases strategic default, so the decision not to repay, and it lowers peer pressure. How do we consolidate these findings that are hard to explain with a rational model? So we interpret the findings that repayment choices are driven by social norms, and our results partially speak to this story. However, to substantiate this interpretation, we then go and present a theoretical framework of loan repayment with social norms, where the one sentence intuition is that flexibility decreases the repayment because the norm with flexibility becomes uncertain. We then reanalyze our experimental data in light of these theoretical predictions, and then finally go back to measure the social norms directly with a comparable sample. So
just one question, Lisa, just to clarify. So I don't know the literature very well. So I was wondering, the previous, when you said about mixed evidence, are all these studies referring to a real life microcredit, or they are only referring to lab in the field experiments?
So those are field studies. And I will talk in the next slide why we conduct a lab in a field experiment, but these other studies are field studies, and in general, the field studies, they can look at the overall effect of ex post and ex ante moral hazard in terms of do people end up repaying, but they cannot really say much about whether this is driven by how people behave in whether they're exposed to more shocks or less shocks, or how well they're coping with shocks, and they will not be able to identify these shocks, and then cannot really fully say something about the ex post moral hazard per se, because that really means that when you are able to repay, you actually decide not to repay.
I had a question on, so this, of course, you're going to give more detail about what you mean by this flexibility in your setting, but just, in face of your introduction, so this flexibility is ex ante or ex post, in the sense of, is it like people they expect to be repaying at certain points in time, but they then can actually change according to last minute conditions, or does it regard ex ante flexibility in the sense that this is not really the same exact? So is it ex ante or ex post in that sense?
Yes, exactly. So we will definitely be looking at the flexibility that helps you insure against small income shocks, where once you know whether you have a shock or not, you can then decide whether you want to use flexibility. So this is different from other versions of flexibility that give you, for example, a grace period. So you only, for example, only need to start repaying after 3 months. This does not really insure you against shocks. So we will be looking at flexibility that helps you cope with small-scale, uncorrelated shocks. Okay, so I already briefly mentioned this. So why do we have a lab in the field experiment as compared to the literature that I cited that are field experiments? So here we really are interested in the identification of ex post moral hazard. And how do we achieve this? Well, we introduce fully observable idiosyncratic income shocks, and this helps us in disentangling the repayment capacity, so whether you can repay from the choice to repay. The second feature of a lab in the field experiment is that we can quantify this social pressure, and we do so by having an incentive-compatible measure of costly punishment, where the social pressure in practice in the field is very hard to observe. Now, these two features you could also implement in just any lab experiment. So why do we need a lab in the field experiment? So the second, the last point that we're highlighting here is that we build on the experience and the existing social capital of borrowers, where we conduct the experimental sessions in borrower centers using loaded framing, which means that we explain the study and the setup with terms that are related to microcredit. So how do we contribute to the literature? As I said, these are the field studies looking at flexible schedules and overall repayment. And here we identify a causal effect of repayment flexibility on the ex post moral hazard, so the decision of whether you want to repay or not in the end. And this is obviously a partial determinant of the overall repayment, which is a combination of ex ante and ex post moral hazard. So whether you have been investing in your business, how much effort you provided, and then also whether you incurred any shocks, and then lastly, whether you actually decide to repay. We also relate mostly to Kristina's study, who shows in a very different context that there exists this excessive punishments of peers where partners punish each other when shocks are fully observable and idiosyncratic to behavior and exogenous to behavior, importantly. And so this is also a lab in the field study. And then there's a relate in our setting to the broader literature on costly and non-credible punishment. And here we identify the interaction of peer pressure in microfinance with the contract structure. So the liability, the flexibility of repayment, how it interacts with the peer pressure. Lastly, more vaguely related, the importance of social norms, and that has been increasingly studied, mostly in the literature in behavioral economics. And here we basically are the first to link the norms literature with the microcredit literature, providing suggestive evidence that norms help sustain high repayment equilibrium in microfinance. Okay, so I will walk you through the experimental design. Okay, sorry, that was a question.
I don't know if you can, yeah, we just wanted to ask about, so because I guess a lot of microfinance institutions now are maybe a few of them are not using joint lending, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I take it that you didn't have a treatment, or did you have a treatment with where you just varied the flexibility, but had individual liability?
Yes, we also have that. So we have a full cross randomization that perfectly leads into a more detailed explanation of the experimental design. So we do have such a treatment. Let me give you an overview, and then I will explain all the treatments in more detail. So we have this microcredit repayment game, looking at individual repayment decisions, and importantly for the identification of this ex post moral hazard, the individual idiosyncratic shocks on repayment capacity. We have a full cross-randomized 2x2 design of repayment flexibility, where you either have flexibility or not, and the liability structure, where we have individual liability versus joint liability. And I will explain all these four treatments in detail in the next slides. Importantly, all the decisions we elicit are via the strategy method. So that means that choices are elicited contingents on different states of the world. And in the end, one state of the world will be randomly drawn to be payout determinant. And then we realize payouts based on the decisions that are being made for this state of the world. So it's incentive compatible, and we use this to look at repayment choices, the use of flexibility, and in the joint liability treatments also the allocation of peer punishment. So now describing the different treatments in more detail, starting with the individual liability treatment, no flexibility. So the general story behind the experiment that we also tell the clients is that clients receive the microcredit loan, and that has automatically been invested. So here we abstract away from all this ex ante moral hazard, how you invest, how much effort you provide. We all take this as given and focus on what happens afterwards. So to simplify things, we have a steady cash flow that is produced by this investment. And we also have a repayment obligation in 3 periods, which is the minimal setting to look at these dynamics. So we have an income of 2 tokens, so to say, in each period, and a repayment obligation of 1 token in each period, and there are no savings. In each period, there's a shock with a probability of 1/4, and that will destroy the entire income in that period. So to fix ideas a bit more, given that here we are in this individual liability setting, you don't have any flexibility. In each period, the choice that you can make boils down to one decision. So either you repay one of your 2 income tokens and then you have 1 left for consumption, or you choose not to repay. That means that you consume both your income tokens. And I will explain in the next slide what consumption means. So now if you repay in all the 3 periods, that means that you will receive a continuation value of V, which symbolizes the value of the future relationship with the bank. So there is this incentive to repay all 3 periods. In this case, whenever you don't repay, so either because you decide not to repay in the strategic default case, or you're facing a shock, that means you default on the loan, you will not receive this continuation value, but you will be asked, if you default, for example, in period 2, you will still be asked about your decisions in period 3. Just to make it very clear, and that's a version of how we tell it to participants. So you have the income of 2 tokens, your repayment is due 1 token, and here in this first period, you can decide whether you want to repay or consume, or not repay and consume 2. Importantly, choices are being made conditional on not facing the shock, which we operationalize as a thief that comes and steals your income. So here, clients make the choices dependent on not facing the shock in this period, but knowing that the shock might still arrive in the next period. And if you choose repay in all 3 periods, you are eligible for this continuation value. Now, I've talked a lot about consumption. What does it actually mean? So we bring different consumption items to the sessions, and we set up a table. So in the corner of each session, we have this so-called consumption table, where at the end of the experiment, when we realize the payouts, clients can exchange their consumption tokens for real-life consumption items. So this is to increase the temptation. Now, importantly, the 3 periods, they elicit, like the choices in the 3 periods are elicited right after each other. So we don't have any time preferences here. But what we do is we induce discounting by artificially reducing the value of these consumption tokens over time. So this helps us mimic that in the first period, consumption is more valuable from the point of today. What does it mean in terms of calibration of all the payouts? It means that, so you will receive the continuation value plus 3 consumption points. When you try to always repay, you still face the probability that you might be hit by a shock in the next 2 periods. So your expected payout of always repaying is actually lower than the expected payout of defaulting. So here, like in a very rational world, we would not see any repayments and everyone would be defaulting all the time. Okay, so this was the individual liability treatment. Now we introduce flexibility in this individual liability world. Flexibility allows you to defer the repayment obligation to the next period. So you get 1 pass token, which you can use in either the first or the second period. So the third period is like a set catch-up period where you cannot use it anymore. So that gives rise to 3 different ways of using the pass token or the flexibility. So if you don't use it at all, then it's essentially the same as in the individual treatment. Or you use flexibility in the first period, then you need to repay double in the second period. Or if you use it later, then you need to do this double repayment later on to receive this continuation value at the end. Importantly here, because it would be way too costly for the bank to check each lender whether they have had an income shock, there is no state verification. So it means that the pass token, this flexibility, can be used independently of the shock. So we leave the responsibility of using the flexibility with the borrower. And given our calibration with early income tokens being more valuable early on, That means that we model this trade-off between increasing consumption in the first period or keeping the flexibility for potential shocks in the second period. So we have this trade-off between increasing consumption and insurance later on.
So when do people know about the possibility of passing?
So that's being explained in the beginning, and then they receive, then we ask control questions, and then we elicit their choices. And we elicit their choices, as I said, in the strategy method, so it's contingent on different states of the world. So we ask them, imagine there is no shock in the first period. Would you want to use your flexibility token, yes or no? And we also ask this for if there's a shock, imagine there's a shock in the first period, would you want to use your flexibility token, yes or no?
So people are reminded about that possibility after the shock happens.
It's like a joint elicitation, so they don't know whether they're facing the shocks. So they're making basically hypothetical decisions for all the possible scenarios they might be facing, shock or no shock. And then we realize afterwards the shocks at the very end, and then look at the choices and pay them based on the choices they made in the relevant scenario. Any other questions regarding flexibility? Okay, joint liability. So we simplify things. We only construct a two-person borrowing group, and it's anonymous matching in the sense that you don't know with whom you're being matched. You know that participants in your sessions are clients from your borrowing center. Importantly, we have automatic enforcement of joint liability, which means that partners simultaneously choose whether they want to repay or consume all income. And when you choose to repay, that means that you will be asked to cover for your partner in case your partner does not pay. Importantly, you cannot condition this decision on whether your partner had a shock or chose not to repay. With repaying, you signal to the bank that you have the capacity to repay, and then you will be asked to cover for your partner independent of why your partner does not repay. So now there's some uncertainty here. When you choose to repay, you might end up consuming one, but you might also end up paying for your partner. The bank in the end does not care like who ended up repaying. So you might be covering for your partner, you might be paying all your 6 income tokens to repay your loans, but that means that in the end, both you and your partner will receive this continuation value. Now, social pressure. Social pressure is operationalized as costly punishment, where you can punish the partner at a cost for their repayment decision. So importantly, this budget of punishment is separate from the repayment budget. So here we reduce the punishment from the show-up fee. So the amount of punishment that you exert or that you receive is not influencing your repayment capacity. And as I said, we use the strategy method, which means that contingent on all the 3 possible actions or outcomes of your partner, you make punishment decisions. So here you can decide when your partner repays and consumes one, whether you want to allocate 0, 1, or 2 punishment points. And the same for when the partner does not repay and receives 2 consumption points, how many of these punishment points do you want to allocate? And then we also ask this for when your partner is being hit by the shock. Here, there's no action of the partner. How do you want to respond in terms of the punishment points? Importantly, as everything else, the punishment is only realized at the very end of the session. So you don't learn whether your partner punished you So your partner or you cannot influence each other by allocating punishment points. You cannot influence subsequent decisions. That means in equilibrium, there should be no punishment because it's an incredible threat. You cannot alter your partner's behavior with allocating such punishment, and punishment is welfare reducing because it's also costly for you. So you should not be punishing here. Lastly, we combine joint liability and flexibility, and using the setup as in the same two treatments, where we have the two-person borrower group, where each of the partners has one pass token. They choose independently from each other when and how they want to use this pass token. And we also again elicit peer punishment conditional on the partner's actions. Now the action space is a bit wider because we also have different versions of flexibility used to ensure against a shock, or use flexibility without a shock, and so on. Okay, so how do we organize the sessions? We have roughly 600 participants in 36 sessions. Sessions last on average 3 hours. So we were not able to run all 4 treatments in one session. That's why we broke up sessions into individual liability sessions, where first we play the individual liability and then the individual liability with flexibility treatment. And then joint liability sessions, where we have individual liability, joint liability, and joint liability with flexibility. So you have this mixture of within and between subject design, where we can compare balance, for example. Here we should not expect any differences, how people behave in the individual liability treatments. And then we can see what happens within person when we introduce joint liability and flexibility, or flexibility. On average, subjects earn a daily wage, so it's substantial incentives, and that consists of 3 parts. The first one is the show-up fee, so for taking part, and then we deduct from this the punishment received and given. So each punishment point, if I allocate it to you, I pay 5 pesos, and your budget is being reduced by 15 pesos. The income tokens that people collect during the game will be redeemed at the consumption table. So here we have in-kind payment, so to say, and then this continuation value of 100 pesos is paid 1 month after the experiment to mimic this really future benefit of this repayment behavior. So in each session, we first explain the general setup. So we explain the individual liability treatment, and we have practice rounds where we draw the shock realization so people get familiar with the probabilities. And then we explain each treatment. And before we play each treatment, we have quizzes to help us understand whether participants understand the rules of the game. All the decisions are made using pen and paper and the strategy method. So there's no feedback in between the treatments. So you cannot learn from one treatment to the other except from introspection. And then at the end, we choose one treatment to be payout relevant. And then for this treatment that has been chosen, we first let each participant draw their individual shock realizations. So for all of the 3 periods, they draw from an opaque bag containing these chief tokens. And then in the joint liability treatments, we match the 2-person borrower groups anonymously. And then based on the actions and the shocks and the punishment, we calculate the payouts. So who are our participants? We invite borrowers of the Filipino microfinance organization Ahon sa Hirap. And borrowers receive loans for investments, either in joint liability loans for general business activities or individual liability loans for agricultural activities. So we pre-select centers based on their location and their size, and then randomly invite members that we get from the exhaustive list of all the members from these centers to our sessions. And so here you can see how the explanation works. Everyone is listening to the explanation of our research assistant, and we have these posters where we interactively explain the different options and scenarios.
Lisa, just to ask, so of the 650 or so participants, what was the level of contacts, since they're all part of, or many of them are part of the same centers? Were you worried about like maybe collusion between people who were playing later versus earlier, talking about maybe some strategies like not to default? Just wondering if that was a concern.
No, that was a concern. So what we did is, so we had at most 2 centers in one city. And then what we did is for those 2 centers, we would visit one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And usually, given that the session was very long, we would directly go from the one center to the next. So there was very little room for the clients to run to the other center or drive to the other center and tell people what was going on. To give you some more background information here from administrative records of the lender. So we have mostly female sample. So here I always give the total, and then the session, the mean for the individual liability sessions and the joint liability sessions, and then importantly the difference, which indicates whether our randomization was successful. And looking at the means, you get an idea of who the sample is. So they're on average 47 years old. Nearly half of them live below the national poverty line. Most of them have access to electricity, but few have running water at home. And they're mainly business owners, half of them, and a fourth of them has farming as their main income. And I briefly said that we have also clients from individual liability centers. However, this is a small fraction only of roughly 18% of the sample. Okay,
so what is the, sorry, one question. What is the percentage of participants that already had experience with difficulties in repayments?
That's a good question. So we don't have data on this. So before conducting this, I did some qualitative field work, and it seems that everyone faces repayment difficulties, but the level of difficulties varies drastically, and it depends on the nature of your business and the shocks that you might be exposed to. So we cannot, I don't think I can say a lot more about repayment problems. What we could look into administrative data on repayments and see whether we could classify any types based on their past repayment behavior. However, this data will be confounded by this joint liability setting, where your repayment record also reflects on how well your group is working, given that your group members will be asked to pay for you if you can't. So I think it will be difficult to classify clients based on how severe of problems they have faced before. Okay, any other questions regarding the design before we start with the results? Okay, perfect. So then I first start with the use of flexibility. So do people understand what's going on, what it's used for? And I will show you individual decisions, no partner matching, to keep the individual and the joint liability treatments comparable. As I said, there is no communication or interaction in these joint liability treatments. So focusing on individual decisions. First of all, do clients understand what flexibility is for? Answer is yes. So we see that in both the first period and then the second period, conditional on still having the flexibility available. Basically, everyone uses the flexibility when they're facing a shock. And there's no large differences between clients in the individual liability treatments and clients in the joint liability treatments. Remember, so this is a between subject comparison. You're either facing flexibility in individual or joint liability. So here, independent of the liability structure, clients use flexibility a lot, which for clients in the joint liability treatment means that flexibility is a preferred shock coping mechanism over relying on your group. Now, we gave clients the option to use flexibility whenever they want, so they can also use it when they don't face any shock. Do clients do this? And the answer is yes. That's what we call misusing flexibility, using flexibility when they don't have a shock. And here we see statistically significantly different behavior in terms of misusing the flexibility, where clients in individual liability treatments misuse flexibility to a much larger extent than in the joint liability treatments. And that's true both for the first period and then again also the second period, conditional on still having the flexibility available. So with this in mind, now let's us look at
Lisa, sorry,
yeah.
Just a question. So how clear was the magnitude of the shock? So could I hold some beliefs that maybe in the next period the shock will be larger than in the first period, so I use flexibility to prepare myself for the next period?
So the shock is detrimental, so you lose all your income in a given period. And importantly, the shocks are not correlated. So for each of the periods, the shock is again individually and idiosyncratically drawn. So in theory, you could also face 2 shocks in a row. The only thing that's most likely driving this is that we have these consumption tokens that are more valuable early on. And so that's why we think we have the substantial misuse here, because instead of keeping the flexibility for maybe you have a shock in the second period, you actually want to have this higher consumption. You get a larger consumption points in the first period. So that's how we interpret these results. Okay, so how does flexibility affect repayment? So again, looking at individual decisions, here we abstract away from shocks to make treatments comparable, remembering that the individual liability treatment you can only repay if you don't have a shock. And again, we don't match the partners. So any effects of joint liability where I'm being asked to repay for you, this is not contained here. These are individual decisions in joint liability, knowing that I'm paired with a partner, but we don't see this impact of automatic enforcement of joint liability in the data. So here I show you the percentage of participants that fully repairs their loan, so repays all 3 periods. And it's surprisingly high. Remember that we calibrated it such that not repayment is monetarily beneficial. However, nearly 70% in both the individual and the joint liability treatment don't repay all 3 periods of their loan. And interestingly, we don't see any statistically significant difference on individual repayment decisions between individual and joint liability. Now, what happens when we introduce flexibility? Repayment drops, and statistically significantly so, in both the individual and joint liability treatments. So we have a substantial drop of roughly 24%. However, there's no difference, again, between the individual and the joint liability treatment. So neither with flexibility nor without, we have differences across the liability structures, but we see this substantial drop in repayments when we introduce flexibility. How does flexibility introduce social pressure? Remember that we elicit the punishment choices conditional on all the different potential actions of the partner. And we elicit this for single periods only for the sake of being easy. So here what I show you now is for a given period where your partner does repay, what fraction of punishment points is allocated to the partner. We do see some punishment also in the repay condition, which is hard to rationalize. Importantly, we see that the share of punishment allocated is substantial when you don't repay. So there's a clear expression of you should not repay with this punishment, keeping in mind that the punishment is sequentially irrational. And then what we're most interested in is this blue bar here, is the level of punishment allocated when your partner does not repay because they face the shock. The shock is fully observable. You know it has been a shock. You know it was not your partner's fault, but still we see substantial punishment allocated in this case. And that's what we call this excessive punishment. Now, how does punishment look like with flexibility? So the first two bars are exactly the same, describe the same situations. And interestingly, we don't see much of a difference here. So the presence of flexibility does not affect the punishment patterns per se. However, flexibility now gives rise to different strategies when you are facing an income shock. Namely, you have two different options. The first one is you use flexibility to insure yourself, or you don't use flexibility when you're facing a shock. And using flexibility to insure yourself against a shock halves this excessive punishment, and so can help to mitigate these adverse effects of disjoint liability when flexibility is used as it should be. If you don't use flexibility, well, then it's nearly as bad as you choosing not to repay. Remember, flexibility can also be used without the shock. So how is that being punished? So the misuse of flexibility is nearly as bad as not using it when you face an income shock. And interestingly, not repaying this double repayment that you need to repay after having used flexibility, that's not a lot more severe in terms of punishment as compared to not repaying. So in a sense, this gives rise to a cheaper strategy. If you don't want to repay, you first misuse the flexibility and then you don't repay double. So you only face this amount of punishment as compared to twice this don't repay punishment. To make this argument a bit clearer, I will briefly show you expected punishment for different repayment strategies. So the idea here is that this is single period actions, but overall we're interested in the behavior of the 3 periods. So we can basically classify clients who always repay and then calculate the expected amount of punishment they would face for always repaying. And similarly for clients who always default, what is the level of expected punishment they would see over these 3 rounds. And so far, not surprisingly, if you have this default strategy where you default in all 3 periods, your expected level of punishment is a lot higher than when you would just always repay. Now, the interesting thing here is really the comparison with the flexibility treatment. Now, flexibility gives rise to different strategies, right? So you can also use flexibility in between and then continue repaying, or you might use flexibility first and then continue not repaying. So we have a couple of more options where the outcome of the green bars are essentially the same. Here, when you always repay, when you first use flexibility and then continue repaying, or when you use flexibility in the second period and also repay in the first and then the last period. Then there are the default strategies. So when you always default, it's what I said already with the argument that I just made with the single period punishment. It is beneficial in terms of the expected punishment to first use the flexibility and then default. So you incur a lower expected punishment. So flexibility gives rise to this cheap or cheaper defaulting strategy. Now this has been a lot of results. So let me briefly summarize.
Can I just ask? Can
Yes.
I just ask a question? Yeah. So, have you collected any information about how flexibility is perceived by participants? So it is signaling of inability to pay, or it is signaling ability to manage funds over time?
That's interesting. No, we did not, unfortunately. So here, what you would be signaling, I think you can just signal to your peer. I think for the broader picture, I think that would be very interesting, how clients think they will signal to the bank when they use flexibility. We do have an exercise that elicits norms, but also this does not answer your question. So no, we don't know what clients think when they see someone else use flexibility. Remember here in our case, though, there's full information in the sense that you know whether your partner used flexibility because they had a shock or because they just wanted to consume more. So for repayment, what we've seen that repayment is high independent of the liability structure, and there are field studies that find the same thing. And we think, or we hypothesize, that this might be driven by a social norm that prescribes repayment. And we see this drop in repayment rates by 24% when we introduce flexibility. And here the interpretation is that the norm regarding the repayment becomes uncertain. For punishment, we have seen that flexibility is beneficial in that it can halve excessive punishment when it's used as designed to ensure against the shock. And it's really preferred over mutual insurance in terms of the shock coping mechanism. For expected punishment, for default, we see that it's reduced when you use flexibility first. And here the intuition would be that you can mask the intention to default. So first you pretend you just want to increase your consumption. You might still repay later on, but then you just default. Now that's all a lot of hypothesizing. So where do we get this idea of social norms from? In particular, we're having this idea of lender-induced social norms, and this is consistent with the several features that have been popped up in the literature. First of all, the fact that microfinance institutions really go a long way to actively shape the picture of a good borrower. So in the Grameen guidelines, and also in our microfinance organization, there's a pledge that clients are asked to recite every time they meet, so on a weekly basis. And this pledge, inter alia, says, I promise I will repay every week and I will ensure that others do so too. So this is exactly these two components that we were looking at: repay every week. So this decision to repay ex post moral hazard, you should be repaying, and on the other hand, putting social pressure on others that they also do so. There's some qualitative evidence as well on the perception of microcredit and norms where repayment rates are lower in cases where the microfinance organizations are perceived as illegitimate or where loans are thought to be a development aid. So here, depending on where the money comes from, also the repayment changes with the source of the loan. And then it's also—
So, Lisa, so flexibility decreases repayment, but but I think I saw a difference between joint liability and individual liability, right? Namely, in terms of unduly using the flexibility. So to a certain extent that so I'm not sure, maybe I misunderstood something. I'm not sure how to understand these two because repayment was more or less the same, like the impact of flexibility was more or less the same in terms of joint and individual, but joint was doing it better in terms of unduly using flexibility, right?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I didn't show you the full picture. I will have a graph and I think 3 slides that hopefully answers your question, just to foreshadow this a bit. So we didn't really talk about partial repayments yet. So people who pay 1 or 2 installments, but not the full amount. And we will see that most of the action is actually coming from those people in the partial repayments. But let me get back to your question when we get to the graph. But it's a very good observation. I also didn't show you the patterns in repayment of flexibility that where repayment for flexibility is higher in the joint liability treatments, which would not answer your question, but that's also something I omitted. Yeah. Okay, just to finish the suggestive evidence, there are stylized facts on low repayment rates for mobile money loans, and these would be consistent with an absence of a strong norm that is enforced through these weekly meetings and everything being done in person and in public, where the mobile money loans see a lot higher default rates than what is usually common in microcredit. So now let's get a bit more concrete, looking at the evidence that we can provide for social norms. So we have a theoretical framework that's in the paper. I will just give you the intuition and show you the predictions, and then we will talk a bit more about these partial repayments and other dynamics. So the intuition of the theoretical framework is that there exists a social norm, and the social norm is installment specific, and it prescribes that you should repay each installment when it's due. And when you deviate from the social norm, you incur psychological cost. So for flexibility, it's basically the same as in the experiment. Flexibility allows you or gives you discretion in the timing of repayments by allowing this postponing of an repayment installment. And now with this norm that prescribes that you need to repay each installment when it's due, the introduction of flexibility weakens this norm because it's less clear how you can apply this norm to the flexibility setting. And this weakened social norm means that you incur a lower psychological cost for non-repayment, and that's why we see a lower repayment with flexibility. From the setting, we derive 4 main predictions. The first one being that when we have strong social norms, the repayment is higher under rigid contracts, so absence of flexibility. The insurance value of flexibility decreases over time, so misuse in later periods will be higher. And we will see that there will be partial repayments that should not occur in rigid contracts, but can be optimal with flexibility. And then using flexibility first and then defaulting strictly dominates defaulting straight away, something that we've already briefly discussed in the punishments. So now, providing you with the full picture of what's going on in terms of the repayments. So this is now a more detailed version of the graph, the repayment graph that I showed you before. So we not only show you the fraction of those who fully repay, so roughly 70%, but also those who do partial repayments, which according to the theory should not occur here in the individual liability treatments, and those who always default. For flexibility, we have 3 more categories, basically introducing the distinction between whether you used flexibility in in these 3 different profiles. And we see that, and that's what I was saying, when we look at the repayment rate, so we see this drop that we've seen before. So the green bar, the sum of the green bars here is lower. And this is mostly driven by an increase in these partial repayments. And importantly, we see a lot of use of flexibility, both in all different profiles, whether you repay, whether you partially repay, or whether you default. So how does this graph speak to the predictions? So first of all, and we've seen this before, we see that repayment is higher without flexibility. So the green bars here are significantly larger than the ones here. We see that flexibility is used when defaulting. So to a large extent, especially in the individual liability treatment, where basically 80% of the participants use flexibility and then default instead of just defaulting without using flexibility. And also in the joint liability treatment, we see that the majority is using flexibility when they fully default. As I said, we have a lot of partial repayments also in the rigid contract. That's nothing we could predict, and I will come back to this because you might worry that partial repayments are driven by confusion, and flexibility treatments might be inherently more difficult to understand than than without flexibility. But I can assure you that we do see that confusion is related to the existence of this type of partial repayment, but confusion cannot explain this increase in these partial repayments. The last prediction, we've seen this already. We see that misuse is higher in later periods, conditional on the flexibility still being available, and that holds true both for the individual liability treatment and the joint liability treatment. Now, there was a lot of hypotheses and predictions, and we analyzing the data that we had, but then eventually we decided to fully convince you, we want to go back and we want to measure the norms directly. So what we do is we elicit social norms using the established method of Krupka and Weber, and it's incentive compatible. We use different types of vignette describing behavior with and without flexibility, and then ask clients to rank or to rank the appropriateness of these actions. Importantly, given that the norm is defined as a common understanding of what ought to be done, the incentives are such that you should match the answer of another participant. So the idea here is that we, by incentivizing this elicitation with this matching exercise or this coordination mechanism, we don't ask for what you personally think is appropriate, but we ask what you think, what others think is the most appropriate thing. So this is how this norm elicitation works. We did this in 8 different sessions on a small sample. So this is more suggestive evidence, as we would say. And we will look at 3 different questions. First of all, do we find the norm for repayment? And then we also want to understand whether these norms for default that we've seen differ with and without flexibility. And lastly, just to reassure ourselves, we want to see whether the punishment in our experiment is an expression of social norms. So this is going to be a large table, so let me briefly walk you through it. First of all, we have the different types of actions here. First, the no flexibility actions, so repayment, non-repayment when you face a shock, and not repayment in terms of strategic default. And I show you here the means of the punishment levels, where higher numbers mean larger punishment. And I show you here the means from our norm elicitation, where we rescale inappropriateness ranking from 0, meaning very appropriate, to 1, meaning very inappropriate. And you can see, regarding this last question that I asked, is punishment reflective of the social norm? And we see that the ranking in terms of how bad something is for the punishment and for the normal elicitation is the same. So repayment is the most appropriate, punished less harshly, and so on. So we also have these different actions for flexibility. Again, having a bit more action, enlarging the action space, where you use flexibility when you have a shock, or you misuse flexibility. And again, we see that the level of punishment mirrors nicely like the mean of the inappropriateness ranking. Now, I've talked about means a lot, but before I told you that norms are actually, the evidence for norms should be a coordination on a same rating. So what I will show you now is actually the ratings on a scale from very appropriate to very inappropriate. And I show you the percentage of respondents who chose a specific rating. So here we see that the mass of people, nearly three-quarters, think that repayment is very appropriate. So here we have a strong coordination on this appropriateness rating, which we interpret as evidence for a strong norm regarding repayment. Now, how does it look like when we introduce flexibility? We see a lot less coordination when we just ask for how appropriate is it to repay. Right, it's the same action, but you know flexibility is available, and already just with the flexibility being available, this norm seems to be a lot less clear.
Lisa,
yeah.
Is flexibility available in real life too? I'm sorry, maybe I missed it.
Sorry, I think I should. I think I didn't say it. No, so flexibility is something new. Okay. So they're being exposed to flexibility here for the first time. So what we do in the experiment, we explain what it is, and here in the normal elicitation, what we do, we also explain it in a similar way as in the experiment, and we also explain what it is for. So namely for the shock coping, but it can also be used freely independently of shocks. So in the vignettes, the information that participants receive about the flexibility is very comparable to the information that participants of the experiment know, but here people are not part of the experiment, they're not using it themselves, they're just judging someone else's behavior, how appropriate it would be with flexibility or without.
And are you concerned that this could be just experimental demand effect, and there is a new device on which I don't know which the right answer is?
I'm less concerned about experimental demand. I think it's always hard to rule it out fully, because I don't think it's clear what it means, right? So would we expect that experimental demand means that I should not be coordinating? Remember, these are monetary payoffs that are at stake here. You really want to match other people's answers. It's just a lot harder, apparently, when we ask about the repayment under flexibility. And I think I'm looking at the norm for non-repayment. It's not so clear that the norm breaks down completely. It still seems that clients know that non-repayment should not be done. However, it's less clear what the norm for repayment actually says. So in that sense, I'm less concerned about experimental demand. Okay, having already talked briefly about norms for default, so briefly comparing the use of flexibility when facing a shock as compared to not having flexibility available and then not repaying due to a shock. And we see there's a large difference in how inappropriate this is. So here again, stressing the idea that flexibility really helps ease this excessive pressure that arises when participants face a shock and cannot repay due to this exogenous shock. And then regarding this cheap strategy out, when you want to default, briefly comparing what happens if you don't pay in 2 consecutive periods. So for no flexibility, we ask the rating of a vignette where the client does not repay once. And then we also ask the rating of a vignette where the client doesn't repay for the 2nd time. So we combine these two and see that it's very inappropriate. It's less inappropriate if you first misuse the flexibility and then don't do the double repayment. In the end, it's the same thing. You did not repay twice. However, you're being, it's less severe in terms of the social norms, and that's also something we see in terms of our punishments. So is there a social norm for repayment? We would say yes. People coordinate a great deal on the respective appropriateness ranking. Do social norms for default differ with and without flexibility? Yes. And we do think that punishment can actually be interpreted as an expression of social norms based on the norms results. Now, you might have thought that, wow, you always conduct it in the same order, first the individual and then the individual with flexibility. So maybe there are order effects. So I think we have 3 answers to this concern. The first one is that the strategy method does not provide any feedback on decisions. So it's very hard to learn anything during the game. We don't realize shocks. We don't give you feedback on how you're doing. We don't give you feedback on what your partner is doing. So there's limited learning possibilities. Also, and I think more convincingly, remembering this graph of the repayment, we see that this drop in repayment happens when we introduce flexibility, which in the individual liability session is after the first treatment. So we only have 2 treatments, individual and individual with flexibility, and we see this drop in repayment just after the first session, after the first treatment, sorry. In the joint liability sessions, however, we see a very similar drop, but only after the 2nd treatment. So if you think order effects, for example, caused by fatigue, would induce this drop in repayment, I think it's very hard to reconcile why it happens in the individual liability sessions after the first treatment and in the joint liability treatments only after the 2nd treatment. Then we have an additional measure of rationality, which is the share of participants who stop repaying after they are in default. Whenever you stop repaying, we will still ask you whether you want to repay in future periods as well. And here the share does not vary across treatments. So in that sense, we are less concerned about the order effects. Randomization, I showed you the balance table. And also, I didn't have time to go into detail, but we can compare the repayment and individual liability treatment in the individual and joint liability sessions, and it's exactly the same. So I think for randomization, we are fine. Then for confusion, we briefly talked about this. We do exclude participants from our main analysis, which according to the quizzes have limited understanding. When we reintroduce those participants, the results don't change. And then I briefly alluded to this. So confusion can explain partial repayments. However, it cannot explain the increase of partial repayments with flexibility. So here, partially, these partial repayments are driven by confusion, but this big chunk of partial repayments that we're seeing in the flexibility treatments is not driven by confusion. And remember that in the theory, or the theory actually predicts that partial repayments can be optimal with flexibility. So to conclude, just a summary first. Flexibility, we see it's really used by pretty much everybody to insure shocks, and it's preferred shock coping mechanism to mutual insurance. So people in the joint liability treatments also use it to a large extent, even though they could also just rely on their partner to repay for them. But we also see substantial misuse, especially in the individual liability treatments. We see very high repayments, given that we set up the game to where default is monetarily beneficial. And that's consistent with our idea of social norms and that are prescribing these high repayment rates. We lower repayment rates when we introduce flexibility, and this we think can be best explained by a weakened social norm for repayment. For the social pressure, we replicate Kristina's results from a different setting where punishment is excessive in joint liability. A large fraction of punishment is still allocated to people who face an exogenous income shock. But we show that flexibility can be beneficial and that it decreases this excessive punishment. However, flexibility also decreases punishment when you're up to strategic default. So it gives rise to this cheap strategy of defaulting. What do we conclude from this? We think that norms not only help explain our results, but they also might help resolve two recent puzzles in the microfinance literature, which why repayment rates not differing between individual and joint liability contracts. And this might be explained with these norms that clients have, so that the liability structure in the end doesn't matter too much. And the norms might also help explain why peer pressure appears to be excessive. So norms as the expression of the social norm, independent of the shock. So in the discussion of flexible microcredit, I think we add two additional points that should be considered. On the one hand, we show a clear benefit where flexibility can help reduce excessive punishment in joint liability settings. On the other hand, we also document a disadvantage where flexibility may destabilize high repayment equilibria that are sustained by social norms. Now, this is a very particular setting, and I'm happy to talk about this more. There are many questions we cannot answer. For example, how do norms adjust over time? As we briefly discussed, flexibility here has been introduced by us. Clients are not familiar with the concept of flexibility. So you might think that maybe in the long run, there might also evolve a norm around flexibility. However, remember that this norm that we're currently considering is a very simple one. You always need to repay when the installment is due. And it's not really clear whether it is actually possible to create similar simple norms regarding flexibility that allow the monitoring and the enforcement of these norms. Lastly, and we briefly discussed this in the very beginning, what happens to other types of flexibility? Right, so some papers in the microfinance literature on flexibility interpret also grace periods, for example, as flexibility by allowing you to only start your repayment 3 months after you received your loan, for example. However, and this goes back to your early question, Pedro. So here we look at flexibility as a shock coping mechanism. These other types of flexibility that don't help with shock coping. So I think with this paper, we actually show that there's an inherent trade-off when you want to introduce flexibility as shock coping mechanism, because at the same time, flexibility can decrease the repayment and increase post-moral hazard. So overall, what we take away from here is that when we introduce regime changes, one might need to consider the prevailing norms. And that's all I wanted to say for today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. Here just brought at the very last slide the official pledge that's recited at each of the weekly center meetings according to the Grameen guidelines outlining how this norm potentially is created and also maintained over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. So I would open the floor to any questions people have at this point. So I have a comment or a question on, so if you look at these repayment rates with flexibility, can you do you have a sense of whether this is feasible in terms of like what would be the impact in terms of interest rates that this would entail, so that maybe this is interesting for the microcredit institution, but of course appropriately priced.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. As you might have seen in our design, we totally omit this question of how can we price this. In the sense, flexibility in our setting is free, right? So you don't pay extra for using it. And I'm afraid we cannot say much about how interest rates would need to adjust to compensate for these potential higher repayments. So yeah, so initially, as I told you, we wanted to use this as a first step in designing a flexible product and then also testing this in the field. And I think in that setting, we would then also need to think about the pricing more. There's one paper where the introduction of flexibility is more costly, and they see that clients positively select into the flexible treatment because there's this additional cost. But I don't remember what interest rate they had in comparison to the baseline interest rate.
I think I saw Mattia unmuting himself. So
yeah, I had a question, a very basic one about the design. So the way you elicit choices is through the strategy method. So you ask to state a preference for every possible state of the world. Mm-hmm. Do you have a precise idea about perceived probabilities of the realizations of these states of the world? So if everybody perceives shocks, for example, the same way in terms of probability of them to materialize?
Yeah, so we don't ask participants directly, but what we do before we start with the choice elicitation, we first explain the individual liability setup, and then we play 3 rounds of individual liability, including shock realizations. So during this practice session, basically, clients draw the income shock realizations in each period. And it's big fun because they're really afraid of drawing a shock. But then they also, over these 3 rounds, which means that they draw it 9 times, they're familiarize themselves with what the shock probability actually means. And this also relates a bit to the question, why is our shock probability so high? This is partially to make sure that people are facing shock, but also so it's easy to understand. Like 1 in 4 is easy to get, whereas lower probabilities are increasingly harder to explain, and they're less likely, and then in the end people might just neglect the small risks. So here we have a quite substantial shock probability that in the end might also affect our results, right? So I haven't talked much about how the different design choices might lead to the findings that we get. So I think the main point here is that we think that the social norms are important. The specific parameters of our setting obviously limit the conclusions we can draw for like real world settings.
Just on that, an additional point. So at the individual level, I think it's pretty easy because you pilot it at the beginning, so they train. But when there is joint liability and you have to compute the cumulative probabilities of 2 events realizing at the same time, or the probability of at least one in more period, or both of them Do you know whether they actually managed to understand that part?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So we did not ask them to calculate these probabilities. So to be fair, the quizzes on the comprehension that we had were somewhat more basic. We explained them what would happen if both were hit by the shock in our interactive posters, but we didn't ask or elicit whether they would be able to compute these probabilities.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we just need to thank you very much, Lisa, for the wonderful seminar, and I think I'll leave it to João now to make sure we have the meetings.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Lisa, for your presentation. So I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you soon. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.